going on? I'm Y-Love, do Jewish hip-hop, trying to make the world a better place through music. Positive hip-hop is pro-unity hip-hop.
Hi, my name is Michelle Rojas. I work for the Israel education organization Stand With Us, daughter of a Jewish mother and a Puerto Rican father, proud to live in Israel today and be educating about this wonderful place.
Just to set any and all records straight, I support everyone. I'm part of the Nobody's Leaving party. But I'd always been hesitant to associate myself with anything Zionist or anything which was connected to the Zionist movement.
I think that Alan Dershowitz said it best recently in his film, the documentary A Case for Israel, where he said what he finds so interesting is that the majority of students who are pro-Israel and who are Zionists are also pro-Palestinian and support that. But the sad fact is that the majority of students, the vast majority of students who are pro-Palestinian often tend to not only be anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, but actually very virulently anti-Israel, and that's a very scary thing that we're dealing with.
Unfortunately today, anti-Israel rhetoric or anti-Zionist rhetoric has gone far beyond being a statement about politics and has gone far beyond being a commentary on current events, but has actually branched off into actually being anti-Semitic propaganda, which is being pushed out through the colleges and universities around the world.
We're seeing this more and more, and I think what's so scary about it is that students are not only being met with criticism of Israel, but as Y-Love mentioned, actual anti-Semitism, where Israel is being demonized, Israel's very existence is being called into question, and Israel finds itself being held at a double standard that no other country is when having to deal with very difficult situations.
Some speakers, when calling Israel into question and when calling Israeli policy into question, are using the term Zionists as just being a clever facade for saying Jews. They use the pretense of complaining about Israeli policy and complaining about subjugation of Palestinian people as just a quick way of saying that they actually have a problem with the existence of a group of Jewish people living under their own rule.
I think people need to be very diligent about this issue and understand when they're dealing with people attempting to use the guise of anti-Zionism or anti-Israel, really what its base is as anti-Semitism is a very dangerous thing, not only for Jewish students but for like-minded people everywhere who aim to end hate speech, especially in universities, and it's something we need to work hard to make sure that it's not happening and it's not a recurrence. And sadly, students are being threatened often in their opinions. They have no sense of freedom of expression in a university campus, which is the first place that students should be able to express themselves.
Now, there are some who would say that, like one particularly anti-Israel imam said on video that Israel is a cancer on the face of the earth, that Israel is one of the biggest violators of human rights in the world today, and that Israel has set up a de facto state of apartheid in the Middle East. How do you deal with such accusations?
You know, I think the accusations are absolutely ludicrous, and I think to use the term apartheid especially is the most offensive thing not only to the Jewish people but to blacks who truly suffered under an apartheid regime in South Africa. You know, if you look at the state of Israel today, Arab citizens, 20% Arab minority we have in the country, have full rights. They are members in Israeli Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. They are lawyers and doctors and students in the university, and they have full-fledged rights in our country, whereas blacks living in South Africa suffered under a horrific regime where they were not allowed to study, not even allowed to go to the same beaches that whites were. So to make this accusation is absolutely ludicrous, and I think it's something we should be fighting against. On the greater level of what you mentioned about human rights and Israel being accused of being this great human rights violators, I think as the world finds itself obsessed with Israel and constantly judging everything that we do under this microscope, we're ignoring the genocide that's going on in Darfur. We're ignoring the situation in Sri Lanka. There's 70 countries around the world today that are currently involved in conflicts, 70, and none of those countries are getting attention because of the world's obsession when it comes to Israel and its harsh judgment of it.
When we talk about indoctrination and we talk about the things that are coming from Hamas-controlled media outlets and things which are being produced in Gaza, do we hear different things coming from Fatah and from the West Bank?
Regrettably, a lot of the findings that have been found on Hamas television are very similar to the findings found on Fatah television or PA television, which is funded by international organizations, including the United Nations. I'll give you one example. There was a music video about a young girl, and the music video is about a woman named Reem, and Reem was a female suicide bomber who had 2 young children, and essentially it's a very emotional video where this young girl is following in her mother's footsteps and saying to her mother, "Dear mommy, I only know now what was more precious to you than me," and that was becoming a suicide bomber. And the video ends with this very young girl opening a drawer and pulling out dynamite and essentially saying that these are the steps that she's going to follow in her mother's footsteps. And that was on Fatah television, that was on PA television. During the operation against Hamas, obviously I was in Israel and I was experiencing it from there, but I heard there were a lot of kind of, very inflammatory reports in the international media. What was your perspective on the situation?
Well, I was under the impression that there was a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Israel knocked out the electricity and was doing all these strikes in civilian areas. Children were being killed and women were being killed. And this was after, how many Qassam rockets went into Israel?
Close to 11,000 Qassam rockets were fired into southern Israel. And what's interesting, you probably remember Israel's withdrawal in 2005.
From the Gaza Strip.
From the Gaza Strip. And the number of rockets doubled being fired out of Gaza after the 2005 withdrawal, and that's something many people don't know about. Israel used 8 years of restraint of not going in, because the truth of the matter is that Hamas is firing from children's schools. Hamas is firing from kindergartens and using women and children as human shields in their cowardly acts. And so Israel, as a moral country and as a moral army, of course the last thing we wanted to do was to go in and accidentally cause the death of a civilian. But it had gotten to the point where we really needed to do something. Rockets were numbering more than 100 a day. And, you just think about it. You have 15 seconds to get to safety when an alarm goes off for a rocket. 15 seconds. Let's say you're a father and you have 2 or 3 children. Which one of your children do you grab first and bring to safety?
The claim is made, though, statistically, somebody has a greater chance of being hit by a car on an Israeli highway than of being hit by a Qassam rocket. They're called rudimentary, homemade, they're firecrackers. Are Qassam rockets something the international community should be so concerned with?
Absolutely. I just think, I've been in Sderot when these rockets have fallen. I can't describe to you the amount of fear. 90% of children living in Sderot are on medication for trauma. 90% of the children living there. When 4-year-old Afik Zahavi was murdered by a Qassam rocket, the world said nothing. Last February, when 8-year-old Osher Twito had his leg cut off when he was out buying a birthday present for his father, the world said nothing. So to make this ridiculous, claim that these rockets are rudimentary or, they don't inflict major damage, they are inflicting damage every single time they land, whether they hit a structure or a person or whatever it may be.